My name is Lori Mullen. I'm Dean of the College of Education at Towson University. On behalf of the university, I welcome all of you who are here in the room with us. We have students, we have faculty, we have alumni who are here, and special guests, and I wholeheartedly welcome you to campus. We're glad you're here for what will be a very compelling conversation. We also welcome everybody online. We are streaming live right now, and we look forward to receiving your questions, which will be answered by our panel in just a bit. I'm really proud that Towson University was asked to host this panel discussion on the PDK survey. This is not a new survey. They've been doing it for over 50 years. But this is the first time they've reached out to a local university to host it. Usually the panel takes place in downtown Washington, and this time they've reached out to us, and we are very, very proud as one of the thought leaders in the state to host this conversation. At this point, I would like to introduce to you Josh Starr, who will be the moderator of our work today. Josh Starr has been the Chief Executive Officer of PDK International since 2015. During that time, PDK has relocated its headquarters to Arlington, Virginia, celebrated 50 years of the PDK poll and 100 years of Kaplan Magazine, expanded the Educators Rising organization. Any Educators Rising students in the audience? Yay, congratulations, we're so glad you're here. For aspiring teachers and their mentors, increased foundation support for PDK programs, and renewed support for PDK members and educator scholars. Under Dr. Starr's leadership, PDK is transforming into a leading nonprofit that serves K-12 educators who embrace the complexity of systems change by organizing around adult learning, and who are dedicated to standards of excellence and equity to better serve all children. Dr. Starr began his teaching career teaching special ed in Brooklyn, New York. He later became a central office leader in school districts in New York and moved on to serve in New York City's Department of Education. After those roles, he served as superintendent of schools for Stamford, Connecticut for 6 years, and prior to joining PDK, was superintendent of schools here in Montgomery County in Maryland for nearly 4 years. Dr. Starr has a bachelor's degree in English and history from the University of Wisconsin, a master's degree in special education from Brooklyn College, and a doctorate in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. He and his wife still live here in Montgomery County, has 3 children who go to school in Montgomery County, and we so welcome Josh Starr. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having us here. So I just want to, before I go into, and hello to everybody out in the ether, on the internet that's looking, there's like about 5 times as many people online as there are in here, so it's a crowded virtual space, and there's also room for us in here to engage in some conversation. So I just want to thank Towson for hosting us. We are trying something new this year. We usually have what I call kind of an inside baseball conversation about poll results in DC, and those conversations are great and interesting, and I actually think that we need to do a lot more to get out to the people who are doing the real work and preparing the people who are doing the real work. So we said, why not go to Towson? We have a burgeoning relationship here. We are doing more and more in the collegiate space these days with Ed Rising Collegiate. Our goal is to support educators from when you first get the idea that you might want to be a teacher when you're 16 or 17, and support you throughout college and then into your career and beyond. And I know we have some longtime PDK members who have been with us for a long time and continue to support people. And so what we want to do is kind of be that tie for folks, and by coming here we get to test it out, and I just really appreciate Towson's support. I also just wanted to say, and I should have said before, so the other thing I'm very proud to be here, the other reason I'm proud to be here is when I was superintendent in Montgomery County, you're hiring a lot of teachers every year. We always knew that teachers coming from Towson were going to be well prepared. right? They always need support, but as everybody does, but we knew we were getting top quality candidates to be with our kids in whatever school they were going to be in the county, whether it's schools serving large populations of English language learners and students receiving free and reduced price meals, or some of the schools in the wealthier parts. And we always knew Towson grads were going to do great things for our kids. So I just appreciate all the work the faculty, the dean, president does to make sure you guys come out well prepared. So I really appreciate that. So I am going to go into the poll results for a moment. You forgot, oh my gosh, please. I do not mind at all, and I forgot to, you're sitting right in front of me, and with the lights on, I missed it, so absolutely.
Well, I knew what I was supposed to do and then forgot when I got up here. We are really honored to have with us, with a very busy schedule, Dr. Kim Schatzel, who is the current president of Towson University, who is here to give a warm welcome to everyone. Dr. Schatzel, welcome, and please forgive my manners.
Well, I can share with you that I'm really excited to see the poll results as well, so I know that's really the purpose of the gathering today. I just wanted to add my welcome to everybody that's here in the room, as well as everybody that's watching this live stream, and how important this giving of information, this sharing of information, this discussion around this topic is. Towson was born as a teacher preparation school, and it's, as I've talked with folks, I've always said that we are a student-focused, student-centric university, and I really believe it's because of the founding of the university, that it's in our DNA to focus on the student. Not too long ago, about 6 weeks ago, we welcomed our students back to campus. We welcomed one of the largest, most academically prepared, and most diverse classes in our history. I was having some conversation about inclusivity and diversity. Our students, our first year class is almost 50% students of color and about 28% African American. It is one of the most diverse classes that we've had in our history. Inclusivity and diversity is a priority for this campus. One is the fact that I firmly believe that you cannot have a high quality university education without having a diverse classroom. We also know the fact that if our students learn to thrive inclusively and to support others to thrive inclusively, well, they'll just be better prepared to lead when they leave Towson University. So we feel strongly of the fact that inclusion and diversity is at the core of what we do as an institution. I can share with you the fact that Towson University is the second largest university in the state of Maryland with 23,000 students. We also have a 6-year graduation rate that is 74%. It is the second highest in the state. And our minority students and majority students and the overall population graduate at the same rate, 74%. There is no achievement gap on this campus based on the identity and the demographic that you bring. Our students, yes. For those of you that are sitting out there listening to this, you know that should be way more the dominant paradigm than is seen nationally. We're a thought leader in terms of the practices that contribute to that. And as I always like to say as well, is that we're serving the state, so we're serving the citizenry and the workforce, and we're preparing students to be able to lead with that. We also have that achievement result at scale. We have 23,000 students, 18,000 undergraduates. And I can share with you that the staff, faculty, and students of Towson University are deeply committed to maintaining that type of achievement and that type of student success for everyone that comes to Towson University. So I look forward to being able to hear the results of the poll. I know how important it is, and I just want to say welcome to Towson University. Thank you.
Okay, second try. So I am going to go through the data, right? I'm not going to go into every single data point there is. You have it in front of you. I encourage people to go to pdkpoll.org, where you can not only see this year's results, but you can see 51 years of results. And then we're going to bring up a panel, and we really have some fabulous, fabulous people, leaders in their field, thought leaders, writers, teachers, just fabulous people who we're going to engage in some conversation, and then we're going to do questions. We're going to do questions from the live streamed audience, and we're going to do questions from the live audience. And I really encourage you all to ask hard questions, right? Don't hold back. We have some great people here to talk about it, and let's have a conversation about how people actually feel about the public schools and what we should be doing. So the kind of headline this year is about frustration in the schools, and I'm going to sort of show you why. And one of the things we were able to do this year, we've been doing it for 51 years. We used to do it with Gallup. We now work with Langer and Associates. Due to some support from Carnegie Corporation, we were able to increase our sample size, which means that we were able to slice and dice our data a little more demographically, but we also were able to include teachers for the first time since 2000, and we were able to do focus groups with teachers and parents. Again, I don't have all of that in here, but I really do encourage you to hear the voices of what people from the teacher and parent perspective really want to see happen in our schools. So some of the main areas we covered, again, we got the teacher perspective. We asked folks about teacher strikes. We asked them about discipline, religion, civics, school funding and taxes, pressure and problems at school, and then workforce preparation. So let's start with teacher perspectives. Okay, here we go. We asked, we wanted to get a sense of how do teachers feel from their community? Do they feel valued by their communities, right? What's the feeling that they have? So one way we got at this was asking about support for strikes. And the red bar is public school teachers. The blue bar is parents. What you can see here is that parents are actually more supportive of teacher strikes than teachers are in some ways. And what we've seen in previous years, parents have so much confidence in their teachers, right? They really do. It's this interesting thing, like the closer you are to something, the more you value it and the more confidence you have, and we see that with teachers. But what's interesting about this slide also is that not only is there an issue around pay, right? You can see that there's certainly support for a strike in your community for higher pay, but there's also a desire amongst parents as well as amongst teachers to see programs being funded, to see teachers having more say in school standards and testing and curriculum and things like that. So what I want you to take out of this is that the public really values teachers in lots of ways, feels a lot of confidence in, and wants to see them leading. And we also know, just I digress for a moment, but certainly I know from my own practice as a superintendent, the more you get teachers involved in leading, the better the school is, right? It just kind of, it's the way that it happens overwhelmingly. When we ask teachers if they feel fairly paid, you can see only 39% of teachers in America actually feel that they're being paid fairly, but there's some significant differences. So the Northeast, where we know teacher salaries are higher, the majority of people actually feel fairly paid. You then go down to the South, and they don't. There's also, you can also follow those patterns through which states are right to work, which states have strong unions, et cetera. Teachers who have been teaching for less than 10 years, only 31% of them feel they're being fairly paid, and 50% of teachers who have been teaching for more than 20 years feel fairly paid. So those are some significant results that we have to confront. Teacher pay is, frankly, the #1 issue that concerns folks. When we just asked people about various reasons teachers have considered for leaving the profession, the top number, 22%, is inadequate pay and benefits. Right? We have a real issue with not paying teachers enough. It is unacceptable. That's my own sort of soapbox, but I'll say, it's totally unacceptable, and we have to do something about it. But then 19% of teachers said stress, pressure, burnout, the workload is what's leading them to consider leaving, and more than half of teachers have considered leaving teaching, right? That's a real concern we have. So there's a question around pay, but there's also the question around what our boards of education, superintendents, principals, directors of HR, unions doing to support teachers and make them want to stay. I got to hold it up, I guess. Okay, we asked about assessing student quality or school quality. Maybe because I have a background in accountability, I'm always sort of interested to see how, and because we've been in an accountability world for a while, and we have these state report cards and all that stuff, what do people really feel? What do they really think is the best way to assess school quality. So green is all adults, blue is parents, and red is public school teachers. There's a clear preference for progress, right? So we test every year. There's a sort of absolute measure. How did your kids do? How did your different kids according to various subgroups do? You know, that is not valued as much as students' improvement over time. So schools and teachers have a real responsibility to show how are we making progress over time, but certainly that's a preferable way of assessing school performance. When we ask parents, how do they assess school quality? Well, they're looking at their child's report card grades, right? That's something that they're certainly interested in. When we, you know, there's very little interest for the state report cards on local schools. Anybody that follows the kind of policy world knows how much time and effort has been invested over the last 15 years to publishing data for parents and getting it out there and grading schools on an A to F scale and that kind of stuff. People don't really actually see that as very valuable. Nor do they see the child's state standardized test scores. And I want to be clear, we asked about state standardized test scores, which does not include, you know, advanced placement or IB or something like that. They're really looking at the state tests. And then interestingly, evaluations from other parents, I think parents take it with a grain of salt because they realize that people are just talking about it from their own perspective. We asked about religion this year, and one of the reasons we asked about religion is because more and more states are pushing for religious education. And there's certainly a lot of interest groups out there. Religion continues to be a divisive issue in America. If you look at our, again, pdkpoll.org, you'll see the percentage of our respondents and percentage of teachers and the, who identify in different religious groups, which is interesting. There is definite interest in Bible studies being taught in the public schools. You see that sort of orange, 61%. Now, we did ask, and we probably should have noted as a footnote, as an elective. People want to see it as an elective, not being forced. But people do want to see Bible studies in the schools. They also have great interest in comparative religion being taught. So folks get it. They see, and it's not religion. People don't want religion being taught for indoctrination purposes, but they realize it's a fundamental part of many people's lives, and they say, you know, we should be engaging kids in this kind of complex ideas around what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen, et cetera. And they felt the same thing about civics, right? And, you know, civics, I think, is a really broad term in lots of ways, and we're going to talk about that a little more on the panel. But people very much want to see civics being taught. 81% of public school teachers want to see it being taught. A lot of folks don't understand how this country works. They don't understand, you know, just some of the basics. You know, the particularly today, as we're more divided than ever, there's just this real desire for civics to be taught. I will digress for a moment. My mother, who is 82, avid, you know, follows education because I'm in it, reads up on politics in the New York Times all the time, is always asking my kids about, I have 2 high school kids and 1 middle schooler, and she always says, well, are they talking about this stuff in school? And my kid's like, well, not really, right? Because we're doing all this other stuff that's going to be tested and all that. And I explained to my mother, you know, there's a couple reasons. One, how do you teach civics, right? It's really difficult to actually engage kids in these conversations where they might have very different opinions and views. 2, it's not incentivized by anybody, right? There's no training for it. It's not going to show up on a literacy test or a mathematics test. And 3, it can be politically contentious when you teach some of these more difficult areas. So, you know, and it always becomes a source of frustration. I said there's not enough time in the day to teach all the things we want. But the American public wants to see not only religion, but see civics taught in our schools. How we do it, of course, is something that is always a challenge. Okay, we asked about workforce preparation. And how much schools should focus on this. And we've asked about this a few times over the last few years. And what's interesting here is the divide between parents and teachers regarding the purpose of school being around academics, which is green, work preparation, which is purple, or light blue, which is citizenship. And you can see where, you know, 53% of parents say that the main goal of public education is academics, whereas only 37% of teachers feel that. Now, these should not be separate, right? We can do all these things together, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the panel. But the differences here are pretty stark, and I do think it is incumbent upon educators to be talking to their communities and their parents about how you're teaching citizenship, but also teaching academics, how you're preparing kids for the world of work, but also teaching academics and citizenship. It can all be interwoven, but we have to be a little more explicit about it because people have different views. We asked people about elective subjects, and there's clear support for job skills, right? 51% of parents with no college degree, which is the light blue, green is all parents, and then college-educated parents is purple. So you can see there are some differences there. But job skills certainly is attractive. Advanced academics, it's about 30%, about a third, a little more for college-educated is more interested in the advanced academics. Art and music is lower than I would like, given what we know about the research and the science, and as a former musician, it sort of depresses me. And we also know, it's interesting, again, a little side note, but we're seeing a decline in my own kids' school of kids going into the band once they get to middle school, and the high schools, it gets harder. I don't know why that is. I think we need to have a resurgence. Again, I'm on my soapbox, but you can see where people are when it comes to electives. Now, we broke it down even more, and this is a very dense slide, so I'm not going to go into all of this, but the far hand left, computer programming, coding, and web development, more than 50% of parents of boys, parents of girls want to see that. When we get into health and medical, look at the divide between parents of girls, which is the red, that's 63%, and 35% of boys. Now, we didn't ask nursing or neurosurgery. My assumption is, and I'm making an assumption here, that they might be thinking more about nursing. But look at the divide there, and then if you go to a couple down where it says building trades, carpentry, notice parents of boys are much more interested in support in those kinds of electives than parents of girls. If you go all the way down to the three on the right, culinary, automotive repair, and cosmetology, there's the least interest in those for the most part. And you also walk into high schools today, you see more auto shops, cosmetology shops, and culinary arts programs. So, we got to think about, are we actually teaching the electives that parents and the public want to see, or are we doing what we've always done because there used to be jobs, because it was easier, whatever it may be. Okay, we also asked about funding. We ask about funding all the time. The answer is no, schools are not adequately funded. You'll note back in the 60s, well, when we asked the open-ended question, lack of discipline from the 60s through the mid-80s was the major concern facing public schools. In the midpoint there in the 80s, use of drugs, and then, remember, that was also like the DARE, Nancy Reagan stuff going on. And then for the past 20 years, or almost 20 years, it's been lack of financial support, right? People get it. People understand that funding is the #1 issue facing our schools. We asked people what kinds of taxes they would support that would go directly to education, and the quote-unquote sin taxes have great support for parents, for the public, and for teachers. So whether that is on legal and recreational marijuana, whether it's on gambling, or whether it's on state lotteries, clearly people want to see that revenue going directly to schools. Whether or not that's happening in your state really becomes a legislative question. We asked about discipline this year, and one reason we asked about discipline, well, a bunch of reasons, but one is that, it's been all over the news these days. There's more and more talk about restorative justice. There's just all this conversation about discipline, so we wanted to get people's views. So in 1969, when we asked this question, the orange bar is not strict enough. The green bar is about right. Forget about the red because it's such a small number. But there's basically a flip between the people who thought it wasn't strict enough and who think it's about right. So the majority, it's a slight majority of parents now think that discipline is not strict enough. It's kind of split. I mean, it's only a 6-point difference, but clearly a lot of folks are questioning whether we're being strict enough. But I want to show you some other data that I think is also going to be really illustrative around this. So we asked about zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is the idea that, you do something wrong, it's in the handbook, there's no wiggle room, you're done. people are very supportive. That's the blue bar, right? They support zero tolerance. But we gave them a scenario. We actually gave a scenario that I personally experienced when I was a school system leader, where a kid, an upper elementary kid, brought in, it was like a Leatherman type tool that he used to tighten his drums. He was a steel drummer, and he forgot to take it out of his backpack on Sunday. He brought it in on Monday. He actually showed it to the, somehow he wasn't hiding and he showed it to the teacher, but it had a knife blade that was longer than what was allowed. And he said, he's like, look, I use this for drummer. Good grades, never been a problem, had to be suspended, right? Because he had a weapon, had to be suspended. This is probably, I don't know, this is maybe like 2003 when we experienced this. And there's sort of no wiggle room, right? So when you give people a scenario like that, their support for zero tolerance decreases. Right? Now, there's still pretty significant support, but there's nuances with all this, I guess, is my point. And we then asked also whether people support mediation versus detention or suspension. So notice the purple. There's overwhelming support for mediation and counseling as more effective than detention or suspension, but discipline isn't strict enough. Right? So we got to kind of hold these ideas, both ideas in your head at once. Yeah, and then about a third of folks see detention or suspension as more effective. Certainly, all adults see it as are more supportive of it than public school teachers. Grading the public schools. This is the question we have asked every single year, and every single year we get the same result. People love their own child's school, which is that 76%. Their community schools, about half the people give it an A or a B. And people think that the nation's schools stink, right? So the idea, again, that if it's close to me, I like it, it's great. If it's out there in the community, I don't know, maybe, it's, I don't really know. And if it's out further away, I don't support it. It's part of the challenge we have around the public narrative around education, that people are talking about things that are far away from them, but they really like their own school. So, sorry, I had one more slide on this. We were able to break down the data this year a little bit more and find it really interesting. So of all, 60% of all K-12 parents give their local school an A or B grade. 76% give an A or B to the school attended to by their oldest child. But look at the difference. Asian Americans, right, are much more likely to give an A or B than Black, Latinx, or white and Asians is somewhat similar. Right? Higher income, much more likely to give an A or B to your oldest child's school than if you have less than 50,000. So particularly when you're in a really diverse school and a diverse school community, don't assume that that people are of one mind. And particularly, and I don't know if you saw the piece in the Washington Post the other day about PTOs, right? Parent leaders typically tend to reflect, the more affluent families. They typically tend to be white, particularly in diverse schools. So they're not, those are not the only parents you should be listening to when you think about how people feel about your schools. So at that, go to pdkpoll.org. You can download this. You can see more from many, many years. There's tons of resources and supports on there. I also want to just note Joan Richardson, where's Joan? Sitting back there, raise her hand. Joan has been directing the poll now for a few years. First when she was editor of Kaplan Magazine, now doing this solely, and is the person that sort of brings all of this together. So thank you, Joan, for all your work on this to put the stuff out there. So now, let me invite our esteemed panel up, and you can see who they are. I'll say a couple words about them as they come up. And I also want to say, I decided this year to do something different also and not really prep them. Right, and just kind of say, here's the poll, you're all experienced and you're ready. So we have Phyllis Vagel, who's a school counselor here in the DC area, now at Sheridan. She had been in MCPS. She also writes Career Confidential for us, which is the only advice column for educators in the country. Right, like real advice. It's fabulous. And she's a Washington Post columnist and just came out with a book, Middle School Matters. I highly recommend it. We have Lynn Gangone, who is president and CEO of the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. She's like the leading voice promoting, pushing, supporting, advocating for colleges of teacher education, been leading that fight. She also has a fabulous TED Talk on women in leadership that why can't she'll say the name later. I can't remember the name of it, but it's fabulous. Robert Pondiccio, who's a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, also a prolific writer, and just came out with a book. I will not say it's great because I haven't read it yet, but all the reviews and all the chatter it's getting say it's great. On Success Academies, Success Academy, the charter school in New York City, and he's changing the conversation about charter schools in some really powerful ways. And then we have Rodney Robertson, who's a 2019 National Teacher of the Year. And Rodney, as you will hear, works with students who are in juvenile detention, which is something close to my heart. I started out working with kids coming out of juvenile detention centers, and Rodney has been making the circuit now for 6 months. Has it been 4 months? 4 months. 4 months. Yeah, he was featured at our Educators Rising conference, and he's going to be sticking around later to talk as well. So we have a really diverse panel of views and perspectives that are going to weigh in on this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Guys, make sure you speak into the mic when you have the mic. And I'm going to go down the line, start with Rodney, and I'm just going to start with an easy one, right? You've looked at the data. What sticks out to you? And from your own, from your own perspective and experience as a teacher, Rodney, what really sticks out to you with these data? So just take like a minute or so to just respond to that. Please speak into the mic.
What really sticks out to me is that politicians don't listen to teachers and parents because they put. Thank you.
Everyone's snapping on the stream as well.
But we have the data that shows us what parents want, what teachers want, yet politicians are still pushing their agenda, what they want, what the testing companies want. And so we really need to which brings me to my other point of why we need civics education. Because if politicians are not listening to the parents and to the teachers, then what are they there for? They're supposed to be representatives of the people, and the people are saying one thing, and the politicians are doing another thing. But another thing, as I read this poll that I think is extremely valuable, is we need the voices of students in this poll. I think students really understand what's going on in schools more so than teachers and parents. And so we really need to get student voice into the poll. And so those would be my top observations or top takes from this poll.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Robert, you've been around, right? You were a teacher, I know. You've been, in the sort of policy arena, one foot in, one foot out for a while.
He's calling me old.
Well, we're probably around the same. Experienced, wise. What's your response reaction when you're going through these data?
I just should reply to Rodney. Look, I occupy a very strange role in this work. I work for an education policy think tank, but I tend to be the guy who, when people are talking about things like data, charters, teacher quality, testing, I'm like, can we talk about what the kids do all day? Because that matters too. So I'm also probably one of the few people in the policy world who is still an active teacher, not a full-time teacher, but I teach civics, oddly enough, at a democracy prep charter school in Harlem in New York City. And if nothing else, in conversations like this, when I play the policy card and people say, when was the last time you were in the classroom? I get to say Friday. So that's a really helpful answer. So look, I mean, I'm aware that there is a disconnect between policymakers, politics, and what happens in the classroom. I'm not going to rage about it because it's a fixed condition. You can't get politics out of education. I always say that education is not above the fray, it is the fray. As long as we are dependent upon public goodwill and dollars to do what we do, we are going to have to simply accept this as a cost of doing business, literally a cost of doing business. Nothing in the poll, and I guess we'll go more into this later, but I'm interested in the civic education aspects of the poll, not surprisingly. I have a view of the the findings of religious education that is counterintuitive, but I'll share that with you later. But nothing, in a sense, really surprises me here. There's one thing that I'd love more data on, the chart that you showed, Josh, that showed the reasons that teachers leave. The first one was
Pay.
second one was stress, et cetera. I'd love to see that same data because I assume looking at the numbers that teachers could only give one answer. I'd love to see that data when they could choose all that apply. I think that would give us a much different view of it. So we can talk about that later too.
And I won't get to it quick enough. Great, thanks. Lynn, you're looking at this from your perch, really supporting and advocating for colleges of teacher ed. We have this crisis, we have this shortage, we have this stuff, we have the politics. How do you see this?
Yes, we have this crisis, and the crisis is that no one wants to be a teacher, except for some of the fabulous students in this room, and also at Towson. But that is a broad statement, but literally, it seems like no one wants to be a teacher anymore. And in 55% of your respondents from your public school teachers who said they would not encourage their child to become a teacher, this is a national crisis, period. And to the extent that we are looking at that from a whole host of vantage points, right? Not only how do we look at the teacher shortage in general, but what we call the shortages inside the shortages. So needing more special education teachers, needing more teachers who teach English as a second language, right? There are shortages even inside of shortages. So we are on the alert at AACTE alongside the rest of the nation and being deeply concerned about these shortages. I would also, there's so many things I would riff off of from what both Rodney and Robert have said. Civics education, we talk about an engaged citizenry is an educated citizenry. And as I was listening to you, Josh, talk about civics and the fear that we would have of having that conversation, I like to think, boy, if we were having those conversations in the classroom, then wouldn't we be learning how to model civic engagement and civil discourse? Couldn't we teach that so that by the time we got into the public sphere and we were considering being in elected office, we might be able to have those conversations with a greater level of dignity? So that, to me, is something I think schools could do. I am concerned, too, and I'll welcome the conversation about Bible study. I think that what I read in that, to some degree, is a sense of wanting to understand moral and ethical behavior. And how do we talk about that? But, we are such a diverse country, and we were built on that notion that everyone is welcome. So those are some points that, again, I would say the Bible study was a surprise. If there was a surprise, it was that. And if there's a fear, it is that teachers don't want others to be teachers.
Phyllis, you've been both working with middle schoolers every day, and you're also a parent of 3 kids who are in schools, and now you're on the circuit talking to people all over the place and getting educators to expose their deepest and darkest fears that you can then assuage them or help them deal with it. So what's your initial reaction to this year's results?
So I was really struck by the statistics regarding teacher satisfaction, particularly in terms of how they relate to students' experience, because if teachers are unhappy, that is directly tied to whether or not students have a positive experience in school. And the other thing that struck me as someone on the ground, and I'm in a K-8, so I'm working with 5 to 14-year-olds every day, is that teachers really want a lot of the same things that my students want. They want a sense of agency. They want to feel respected. They want to feel that they're allowed to challenge the status quo and that they're not powerless. And I think a lot of the aversion we're seeing to education as a field is related to potential teachers' perception that they are going to be a cog in a wheel, that they aren't going to have a voice, and that they aren't going to feel that sense of purpose because they just will be mirroring whatever it is that their system wants them to do. So the more that we can bring back that teacher voice in the same way that we probably all who are in education are trying to empower students to use their voice, I think the more will turn the dial and bring back people into the fold.
Yeah, all right. So since there, thank you, all of you. So since there seems to be some interest in the civics question, let's get into that. And when I first read these results, clearly the frustration stuff is just looms so large. But I was also very intrigued by the civics and the religious thing, because I think that there is the sort of soul of education is missing. Like, people want something more, and they're not getting it. So I guess the first question, and actually, Robert, because I'm going to put it to you, because I know you've done a lot of work in this area. Can you first, like, almost define what civics education is? Because I think it's broad, right? Like, it's this big term. So when we talk about civics education, what are we actually really talking about?
Boy, that might take more time than we have. It's worth noting, I like to joke that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having once uttered the phrase college and career ready. The founding purpose of American public education was preparation for citizenship. Now, once you say that you can take that in any different directions. Is it character education? Is it SEL? Is it just straight on, here's how a bill becomes law that we remember, those of us who are old from, Schoolhouse Rock way back when? I want to propose an even broader lens, which is a lot of us who do civic education talk a lot about the need to cultivate a spirit of civic engagement. I would actually argue that schools are not where kids go to learn civic engagement, but often where they go to experience it. In other words, if you think about this, the first and probably most important relationship that a child has with a civic institution, with the exception perhaps of a church, is with his or her school. And if you look at the data, as that relationship goes, so go all the other ones. In other words, at the risk of oversimplifying, the best civic education is simply education. The further you go in your educational trajectory, these trend lines are unmistakable, the more likely you are to vote, volunteer, be civically engaged, however you choose to define it. So, whether we focus on it or not, the mission of public education is civics. One last thought on this. Here's how much we have gotten away from this. I wish I had this data in front of me, but a few years ago at Fordham, not this is indicative of everything, but we did a little experiment where we pulled the mission and vision statements of the 100 largest school districts in the country, including yours, to see to what degree this was even on the minds of men and women when they sit down to say, what do we do in this district? This just did not come up. I'm oversimplifying. It comes up in some forms, but when you look at the language of our mission statements, not that this drives lesson plans, this is truly the forgotten purpose of American education. We simply don't think this is our job.
Yep. So I'm going to go to Rodney and then Phyllis and then Lynn on this, because I want to hear both Rodney and Phyllis from your perspective, sort of on the ground, as you're seeing this in schools. Like, how do you approach this desire for civic engagement? Civic engagement. How are you seeing it with your kids and your parents and other teachers and whatever it may be? So, Rodney, talk about that a little bit.
Well, twofold. Can you hear me? I can't tell if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe that my job as a social studies teacher is to create civically engaged, socially conscious students. That's where it becomes tricky, because as we talk about civics, the whole purpose is to teach you how to be American, whereas different people have different experiences of what America is. And so when you get into civics engagement, for some groups, it's about patriotism. For some groups, it's about being displaced and disadvantaged in America. And so when you bring those ideas to the table, it gets really tricky. And for my students, who've all have been victims of various systems, it gets really tricky. And so what I try to do is I try to engage, empower them, and if borrow a phrase from Bettina Love, I do abolitionist teaching. I teach my students how to be participants and how to take part in the system, and if the system does not work for them, then they need to work to change the system.
Phyllis, what are you seeing at the ground level around this issue of civics?
So when you think about kids and what they want, they're so highly attuned to injustice. They're actually wired for moral action. Their brains are actually different than adults. So if we don't capture this time in their life when they're exploding neurologically and when they so badly want to be seen as somebody who can make a positive change in the world, then we're really missing an opportunity. And then the second thing I'll say on this point is that when you think about the challenges that kids have growing up, whether it's in terms of their sexual or gender identity or their immigration status, or there's been some situation where a certain group has been oppressed, when they come to school, they want to talk about it. They need to know that their teachers will talk about it. They have to process it with the adults in their life. And if their teachers don't address it, and if their schools don't address it, they're sending the message that it doesn't matter, that it's not important. And peers, too, their peers also want to support their classmates and don't know how to do that all of the time. So when we're teaching them these critical thinking skills and we're telling them the difference between a good source and a bad source, or explaining how they can use their voice, they're not only able to understand that they themselves are worthy of dignity, they are better equipped to support their friends who might be going through a rough time.
Great. So Lynn, from, again, big sort of picture view, like why aren't we preparing teachers to teach civics? And I'm going to, so it's not just civics you're talking about, right? As you all, as the three of you describe it, it's much more than just learning how the American government works, right? There's this sort of way to use it as an impetus to create greater community and connections. But Lynn, like why is it so hard? Why aren't we doing it? And what can schools that are preparing the next generation of teachers do about that?
You know, part of, as I'm listening to this commentary, I'm thinking about witnessing the March for Our Lives. And I'm thinking about witnessing all of those kids from Parkland who got up on a national stage and led a protest to control guns. And I'm thinking about all the other kids I saw at that march and the teachers I saw at that march and the profound impact that that level of civil engagement had on me and I think on the nation. And so I would say that perhaps there's not a formal preparation and we know we need more, but there is something happening. And I think that candidly, this new generation of students is going to lead the way. I mean, yesterday in Washington, D.C., we had a climate march. And I will tell you, most of the folks that I saw marching were the age of the students I'm seeing in the audience here today. So while there is not necessarily an emphasis on civics, we believe that there needs to be, and I think you've spoken to this, there's so many other things that we're asking of our teachers and our teacher candidates to teach too. You know, I think Rodney said that as well when he was talking about, you know, teaching to the test. When I think about schools around the world, you know, Finland is known for being a great school system. Why? Because they actually let their kids move. You talked about neuroscience, Phyllis, right? I mean, there's a way in which I think we can have the capacity to incorporate civics, incorporate what we know about neuroscience, but we have to start to push against the boundaries of what folks say is required and start really using what we know about what matters. Civics matters, movement matters, things that matter. I think we need to give greater voice to that and to simply start to challenge the status quo of what we say belongs in a classroom and belongs in teacher prep.
Rob, you want to weigh in on the civics?
Yeah, because I just want to bring this
else?
back to a point that I made earlier, because I'm not disagreeing with anything you just said, but you have to kind of look at the big picture context in which we operate. One of the reasons that civic education, and I don't want to wonk out on you and some of the particulars of the pedagogy that can be controversial, but one of the reasons that civic education is the forgotten purpose of public education is because we simply don't know how to measure it, or we find the measurements unsatisfactory. A lot of what we do in this work, and remember that tension between public education is the phrase. So you have to accept the fact that there's just a structural relationship between public funds and what we do. With public funds comes public accountability. So what can we measure? Well, we can give reading tests, we can give math tests, we can measure whether or not kids go to college, whether they graduate from college within 6 years, et cetera. Well, what civic education outcomes do you want to measure? How do you measure them? What's the time frame? So these things, we acknowledge that they are important, but we tend to say, well, that's so hard to measure, so we're not going to measure it, and therefore, axiomatically, it becomes the forgotten purpose, because as my first principal that I ever worked for said to me all the time, you must inspect what you expect. So that's the issue right there.
That's the area we're in. Okay, so I want to sort of shift it a little bit to the purpose of school being around jobs, or citizenship, which is similar to the civics, or academics. And Rodney, can you, I mean, you work with a population of kids, with a tough population, right? They're vulnerable, and there's a lot of need to get them to not only be prepared academically, but also to get them to be prepared to go out into the life that has not always been kind to them in many ways, and help them be successful. So how do you see this question around, is it academics, is it work, is it citizenship, is it all three? Like, how do you approach that as a teacher?
Well, to me, it's, with my students, it starts with citizenship and civics engagement because they're labeled, they're stigmatized as they go back out in society. So their number one obstacle is fighting the barriers that are in place that are preventing them from getting the jobs, preventing them from going to school. And so to me, I think civic engagement is most important to my students, that they feel valued, that they feel like they're important members of society, because they can know everything, but as long as that little box is on the application that says felons cannot, apply, then it means nothing to them. So civics engagement is the most important thing when it comes to my students.
But what about the academic piece there, right? So you teach them the citizenship piece, you teach them to re-enter, all that, but then their reading, their mathematics, whatever it may be, isn't good enough. So how do you balance that?
Well, a good teacher can do it all. I mean, not the.
They have to.
Yeah, you have to.
to,
And so you can teach citizenship through literature. You can teach citizenship through science. And so it all works together. And so it's not like you're choosing one or the other. But as long as they learn everything and that barrier is still in place, then they're not going to be successful in life. So it's really important to do all, but you can incorporate everything within your subjects.
Lynn, talk a little bit about this tension between the preparation for work and the desire for more. And it's interesting, in previous years, we've also seen significant support for work preparation, but then preparation for academics. Like, Lynn, what's your take on that from your perch?
Well, I have to say the first thing that I noticed in your chart is no one asked anyone if they wanted to be a teacher. I was like, okay, so we have culinary over here, and then we have computers over here. I'm like, what about?
Well, once Educators Rising is in every single high school in
Fair
the
enough.
country, then we'll be able to test that
Fair
data,
enough,
right?
and we support that, as
Yeah.
you know, Josh.
I know.
I think as someone who came from a liberal arts background as an undergraduate, right? I mean, I have to talk about this from a personal experience. There is a way that learning how to think and write and be in the world needs to be balanced with having a particular skill. And I think that there are a number of things that are impacting this, right? I mean, I think that parents are looking at cost of education, not in the we're not talking K to 12 right now, but we're talking college, right? So they're thinking about how are we going to prepare our child to be meaningfully employed in the world. And certainly what parents of millennials are seeing is that's not happening. So I think that there is a greater stress on the public schools than to prepare for work when we see that our younger generation is not being able to move into jobs in the same way. I personally don't agree with that. I do think that we need to create the whole student, not just a student who's ready to go in to a skill, whether that skill be computer programming or automobile mechanics. The other thing I do want to say, Josh, because I started my career working for Carl Perkins Vocational Equity Monies back in the 80s, so Robert, I may be older than you, doing something called sex equity work. So I would travel around the state of New York and work with teachers and guidance counselors in professional development to talk about gender and race equity. And it's striking to me that still, on your chart, we saw some very definitive ways in which we expected boys and girls to engage in career. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to me, I don't know how many years later, that we're still seeing this pink and blue manifestation in somewhat different colors on your chart.
That's a perfect segue then to Phyllis. Can you just, because I know you had a piece in the Post about that a little while ago about boys. Talk about a little bit about that, what you see at the ground level, and then we're going to go into the discipline conversation.
So I was, and this is more of a story, but I was running a group for the boys in my school, the middle school boys in particular, who had started this group themselves. And the reason they initially started it was because they wanted to have a group just like the girls had their female empowerment group, and they thought it was unfair, and they felt that they should have their own affinity group. But what came out in the course of running this group is that what they really wanted was to be able to get outside that man box, to express the full spectrum of emotions, to be able to say that they really like school or they like to read, or that they'd be really bummed out if a friend dropped them, or to just honestly express what they needed from a peer. And so over the course of about 18 months and having these conversations with them, at first they wanted to have a meeting with the girls group and almost challenge them and say, we have it harder than you do. Meanwhile, the girls didn't care about the boys at all. The boys were like, what are the girls saying about us? I was like, nothing. They're not thinking about you at all. And so I promised them, though, that when they were ready, when they had dealt with their own stuff, and when I thought it was going to be productive and not adversarial, that I would bring them back together with the girls group. And ultimately, by the time I did bring the two groups together, it was really amazing. I did the man box activity where you read off a series of adjectives, and you ask the kids if it belongs in the, quote unquote man box, meaning it's a culturally acceptable emotion. And the boys and the girls were in complete agreement about what was acceptable and unacceptable. It was okay to be angry if you were a boy, but it wasn't okay to be compassionate if you were a boy. It was okay to be vulnerable if you were a girl, but it wasn't okay to be ambitious if you were a girl. And by the end of the meeting that they had together, they realized that if they could bust one gender out of their constricted role, then it would benefit both of them. So I guess my takeaway to this question is that yes, the survey doesn't really represent what the actual students would say about what they're hoping will change within education. And I think that we're seeing just with the political activism of youth and also what's happening with the younger students today, that there probably are major changes ahead.
Right. And we can see where they're getting some of these messages from. So while, Phil, stay with you a little bit. Let's talk about the discipline piece, right? And I know all of you are going to want to weigh in on that, but I find it really interesting, right? So we're not strict enough, but do mediation, and yet zero tolerance is good. There's all this some kind of competing ideas about it. And I know just from personal experience, I always tell people when I was superintendent, I never said reduce suspensions. Talk about metrics, right? Never use the suspension reduction metric because it's easy to reduce suspensions, right? What you do is increase relationships, right? Improve relationships, and then you get suspension reduction, and you can measure all of that. But sometimes the way we talk about it is problematic. So what are you seeing at the middle school level around this discipline issue, both from what teachers are saying and parents are saying and kids are saying, and then we're gonna talk more about the panel.
So I think one of the things that's most helpful for rising teachers to understand is the childhood development piece and to understand how kids are wired. And ideally, I think all teachers should take a counseling class. That's just my perspective. But when you consider discipline, number one, you're not going to get anywhere by shaming a child. You're just going to paralyze them. If you're going to be imposing a consequence, then you need to be also showing them a way forward. So maybe you validate why they did what they did. I can understand why you pushed them because you were upset, and that makes sense to me, but here's why it's not okay, and now we need to talk about how you can make it right. And it's that final piece, that making it right, that will keep a kid from getting stuck and from repeating those same behaviors. I think a lot of the opposition to practices like restorative justice is that it's misunderstood, that people don't understand that it's not incompatible with imposing consequences. But if we are to get the best results possible, we have to make sure everyone understands how to use restorative justice and how to apply it with fidelity, and also how to value those relationships first. Just as you were saying, if there's no underlying relationship and no trust, then you're not going to be able to change the sequence of events.
I'm going to go Robert, Rodney, Lynn. Robert, talk about it from two perspectives. One is, some of your colleagues at the Fordham Institute and other places have been questioning restorative justice, right? And then you also just spent a lot of time at Success Academies. It was known, or there are a lot of beliefs and mythologies about how they treat their kids. So can you talk about both those perspectives, your view on the discipline question?
I'm going to invoke the late Paul Songas, who said, "That's a very interesting question. Let me try to avoid it." Look, this is so damn complicated, and the closer you are to the ground, the more complicated it gets. And it may be one of those issues, and here I guess I'll align myself with my Fordham colleagues, that maybe is just too hard to solve with the policy lever. I will say I think parents are a lot more savvy about this stuff than we are in the policy world. Look, if you're a parent, you want your child to be safe in school. Period, full stop. It's a non-negotiable. My child should not feel safe, be made to feel safe in school. Shouldn't be bullied, shouldn't be intimidated, etc. That is not too much to ask. And that's one. 1A is, well, when there's a child in my child's class who is making my child feel unsafe, who is disrupting things, who is sucking the air out of the classroom, well, you got to do something about that. And you can't give me, and I'm not saying this is, but what lands on many parents' ears as this mealy-mouthed mwah about restorative justice, etc. That kid hit my kid. That kid is, parents are just not wrong about this. So this may be an area where we in the policy world are trying to lead parents in a direction that they do not want to go. Now, please do not hear in what I just said that, oh, Pondicio, you're against restorative justice. Oh, Pondicio, you want to throw kids out of school. No, did you hear me say it's complicated? Because it's complicated. But I'm just not sure that policy is the correct lever. One of the real tensions in all of this, Josh, and I saw this in a lot of the polling data, is where do we trust ground level educators to make the decisions, and when do we feel like we need to intervene to protect students' individual rights or whatnot? And nowhere is that tension more closely felt than in issues of school discipline.
Yeah, Rodney, what's your take on it? I mean, you're dealing with it on a daily basis, right?
My thoughts are a little more concrete than others, but personally, I think students should be suspended, period. They should not be suspended. If the purpose of school is to educate students and to prepare them to be better students, what does putting them out of school do? It doesn't do anything, but usually sends them back to the same environments where they learn the aggressive or the bad behaviors. Number two, I think when you look at zero tolerance in your poll, I think you gave them a worst case scenario of a student accidentally bringing a knife or something like that. Well, 95% of suspensions for zero tolerance are for nonviolent offenses, most commonly dress codes. We have to take into account things like that, and then when you get into those issues, you definitely need to talk about the racial disparities when it comes into suspensions, especially when issues such as dress codes and how young black women are targeted. And then in Virginia, where you have, for every one white student, you have 3 black students suspended. And then when you get into students with disabilities, it's 1 to 5. And so you have to talk about these issues. You have to put policies in place. You have to train teachers. You need to completely remove police and school resource officers from the school environments, because that also increases the number of suspensions, especially for our black and brown youth and our students who are LGBTQ. Those students are overrepresented in suspension numbers because we have people in positions of power who don't understand discipline or cultural relevance. So I think, A, we should eliminate suspensions, period, take the money we're using for school resource officers and use that money for restorative justice training, because it does work when everyone is on board. So and lastly, we need to invest in more mental health workers, more social workers, more guidance counselors who aren't just doing schedules, but who actually get a chance to guide the students. And so
when, I should just say before we go to Lynn, a couple years ago when we asked people about those kind of services, wraparound services, mental health services, overwhelming support for them from the American public, whether you are Democrat, conservative, independent, liberal, moderate, north, south, black, white, doesn't matter, the overwhelming support. Lynn, what's your take on the discipline issue? And how should, I'm going to ask you, like, we're in a school of education, right? How should schools of ed be thinking about this? Because we know behavior management and classroom management is one of the greatest challenges that new teachers have. It's one of the things that drives them out because they don't know how to do it. And a lot of schools just don't know how to support teachers with it. So what's your take on the discipline question?
So I also, I want to point out first, if I might, Josh, I think it's
course.
important to note in the responses on this, the disaggregation by race and the lack of trust that particularly Black parents have in regard to this question. And Rodney touched on that from the perspective of how students are treated based on racial, ethnic, sexual identity, disability. But, you know, to me, the statistic that said, you know, 59% of white parents trust in schools to administer discipline fairly and 40% of Black, which means, of course, that 60% distrust those decisions. So I just think to the extent that we can start to disaggregate some of these responses is really important information. You know, it's interesting, we have been talking a great deal about this inside of our colleges of education. There's more work being done with regard to what we call culturally responsive teaching. So to the extent that, and this is particularly important because, and I say this with all due respect, right? We know that most of our teacher candidates are Caucasian women who come from fairly middle-class backgrounds. So they constitute what's a typical or a stereotypical collegiate student looks like. And so the capacity that students have to move out of their lived experience to understand the lived experience of someone who's very different than them is incredibly important. And, you know, as you talk about wraparound services, I'm glad that everyone thinks that we should have them, but no one wants to pay for them. And, you know, we're going to talk about your slide on, you know, sin taxes. But, you know, there are some innovative ways that colleges of education are approaching this, and I'll give you one example. At Arizona State University, they're doing something where they are actually sending teams of teachers into school districts. So in the same way that you would take doctors on rounds through, you know, obstetrics and gynecology, through psychiatric care, et cetera, you know, these are teams of students going into a school and they're learning all the parts of the system. And I think that to expect one human being, and Rodney, I'm glad that you can do it all, and that's probably why you're the National Teacher of the Year. You are superhuman, you know, and that's why you're where you are, but most folks cannot do every single thing that a teacher now is required to do. Our students are much, you talk about complexity, our students are much more complex. Demographically, they're deeply different. Emotionally, psychologically, I mean, even at the college level, we're seeing this crisis in mental health for collegiate students. So one person can't do it all. So I think that our colleges of education are starting to look and say, how can we differentiate our approaches? How do we not just prepare that one student, but how do we look at teams of students, teams of teacher candidates going into the classroom? And I would also say that the clinical practice experience that colleges of education are engaging in, again, a much more expensive model, but deeply helpful to have a full year in residence with a mentor teacher, supported by those faculty back on campus. But we have to think about how do we support those students, because most students today, we know, have some form of financial aid, are working or have families. So again, the complexity of this is not lost on any of us, but I do know that our colleges of education are taking this very seriously and doing what they can to support various strategies to address this issue.
So we're going to, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we're going to go to questions from the virtual and physical audiences. But I do just want to note, I really appreciate, Lynn, you mentioning some of the data that's disaggregated. And I know I keep pushing, you know, going to the website, but it's really, there's just so much more information on there that you can slice and dice in different ways. And, you know, there's only so much you can put up. And particularly when you're in places like, you know, places like Baltimore County and Montgomery County, where you have really, truly diverse schools, don't assume that what one parent group thinks is okay, another group of parents thinks is okay, and you have to get to know them individually. So let's talk about the big headline, though, right? The frustration in the schools and why teachers either are thinking about leaving. You know, last year we saw parents don't want their kids going to teaching. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So I am going to start this with, I'm going to go Robert, Lynn, Phyllis, Rodney on this question about frustration in the schools. Like, what's going on and what do we do about it? And then we're going to go to the audience.
I am so glad that I get to answer this question in front of a group of
You were just so
future
eager, I felt
teachers.
like I
No,
had to,
no, I
you
mean, this
know.
is, look, and this, I don't think this came up, but I was a public school teacher in the South Bronx in New York City for 5 years, literally teaching. District 7, the South Bronx, is the lowest performing district in New York City. My school was the lowest performing district or the lowest performing school in District 7. So we will have that in common in many. So here is something that you're not going to hear in your teacher preparation program, but I think really gets to this question of frustration. And I say this all the time. Teaching is the easiest job in the world to do badly. It is the hardest job in the world to do well. So I don't want to be flippant, but if the thought of quitting does not cross your mind regularly as a teacher, you're doing it wrong. I'm serious about that. In other words, there is no end of what you need to do, especially if you're dealing with disadvantaged kids and in schools that have issues, as many, even most of you will be. So I don't want to make light of the finding, but it's a damn hard job, okay? And it doesn't get that much easier. Yes, there are things about it that do get easier. You've got your lesson plans, you get to know the students and the families. But again, if you're not frustrated, if you're not going home 2 days out of 5 with tire tracks on your back, you're probably not all in. And I mean, nobody's going to tell you that, but I think it's kind of true. That's not to say we should have martyrs. I mean, God bless you that you're saying, you know, teachers have to do it all. I can't do it all. I've never been able to do it all, but you got to do a lot. And it is the most difficult work that I've ever done. Period, full stop. And it's the most difficult work you will ever do.
And the most rewarding.
Amen.
Right. Just want to make sure we throw that in there. Lynn, what's your take on that? The frustration in the schools, why people don't want to go in, what we can do to attract folks in, you know, what's your take on what's going on?
Phyllis, I think you talked about this a little bit earlier when you talked about sense of agency. That was you who said that. Oftentimes, when you look at this idea of teacher leadership, right, sometimes it's just an idea. And I think that's part of the challenge. When we actually talk to teachers, their sense of agency is incredibly important, that they don't just want to be that cog in a wheel like you said earlier. So we're looking at how do we create the capacity alongside our partner schools to create more emphasis on teacher leadership in collaboration with principal leadership. For example, there's a lot of work, the Walls Foundation has invested a great deal in principal leadership. We'd like to start talking more about investing in teacher leadership because, Robert, what you said is true, and those teachers need to be able to then take their lived experience of the hardest and best job in the world and create something inside of their very schools around, how do we make it better? Not easier, right?
Not easy, but easier.
And better. So for us, the concept of teacher leadership is something that we're pursuing as a vehicle, because when you really talk to some teachers, the pay issue falls away. And I'm not saying don't pay teachers more. Don't hear that. Because teachers need to be paid more. Period, exclamation point. However, if they can have a sense of agency and worth inside of the very school and the students that they serve, that becomes a balance to the fact that, I was just in an Uber this morning and the guy was married to a special ed teacher and he was talking about her experience and how she uses her own money to support her students. That shouldn't be.
So before I go to Phyllis and Rodney, I do want to just jump
Josh,
in on
can I
the
add
teacher
one
leadership.
quick
I'm
thought?
moderating. I'll get to you in a second. I will get to you in a second. No, well, just the teacher leadership piece. So you're right. My frustration with it is sort of like in graduation speeches where we say to kids, oh, you now have to solve all the problems that we adults messed up. In the same way, like teacher leadership is essential, it's critical, it works. But there's this through line in the whole system. So principals are really important, but then what about principal supervisors, superintendents? Like, how do you build teacher leadership into the DNA of the system. So it's not just, okay, teachers, now lead also, right? And while you want to do that, there's all these structural pieces that we're not attending to that my former hat gets frustrated by. All right, Robert, you can jump in really quick.
Real
10
quick.
seconds, then Phyllis, then
10
Rodney.
seconds. The other thing we never talk about, we make this job too damn hard. Okay, and for structural reasons that I don't have time to talk about, a lot of them pertaining to instructional materials and curriculum, we basically tell every teacher, well, you're the best person to know what every child needs. And as a first-year teacher, you're like, what? I just got here. Help me.
Right. Phyllis, talk about the teacher frustration piece.
So I'm
and
actually
Rodney.
going to reference a PDK column from last week, and I get questions from educators, so I start to see some themes. But the question that came in last week was from a teacher who said, I've always wanted to be a teacher. I've been playing teacher since I was 5 and would give tests to my siblings, and I love the work, but I'm so frustrated by all of the above that we've discussed today, and I want to be happy, and I don't think it's serving me to be miserable. And what can I do? And so I had to put on my therapist hat to answer her. But what I mentioned was it's not really about not challenging the status quo. You should always challenge the status quo. You should always look for ways to exercise your voice. But I think it's important, and I was saying this last night to Georgetown University seniors too, who I was guest lecturing a mindfulness class, and they were talking about some really horrible cubicle internships that they had had, and we are seeing that people are fleeing the profession really quickly, and younger people might have less of a frustration threshold or tolerance for jobs that have all of these built-in challenges. So I think it's important as you're heading out into the work world, if teaching is what you want to do, I don't think you need to flee teaching. I think you need to figure out how can you be proactive and stay optimistic, and how can you find supports for yourself, and how can you look for the good in the difficult moments, and just recognize that every job will have its challenges, and you're going to hit rough spots along the way. I think one of the things I've seen in education, and this has come through in the column as well, is that because you're not trading on money, because you're not getting promotions, because you're not getting as much external validation as you might in another field where you're trading stocks or something, it can become more competitive, and people can become less likely to support one another, and to really embrace the idea that you make the pie bigger when you share lesson plans and when you reach out and offer a hand to somebody who's newer in the field, and just recognizing that the more you give, the more you get. And so for that person who wrote in, one of the things she had complained about was the validation piece. She really wanted her principal to give her more feedback, more validation, and it was something she was ashamed to admit, but that she felt. And I shared the story of someone I know who was proactive about it. And here's an example of being proactive instead of passive. She went to her principal and she said, I think I need more external validation than most. I thrive on praise. I'm wired and motivated by it. And I just know that about myself. So would it be okay if I checked in with you at regular intervals to make sure I'm on track? And she was a lot happier than this letter writer who was just waiting and waiting and hoping she would get a morsel of praise. So just at every step of the way, as a teacher, just constantly be looking for ways that you can be proactive.
All right, so Rodney, you are not only using your own experience to sort of push some issues nationally, but you're talking to teachers out there. They're talking to you, right? What are they saying to you? What's your sense of this question around not only frustration, right, but what we should do about it? And the thing I also am thinking about, based on some of the feedback we've gotten from the panel, even if you can do it all, right, should you be expected to? So how should we be thinking about this question of the frustration in the schools that teachers are expressing?
Well, to me, no one should be expected to do it all for $35,000. I mean, it all comes back to teacher pay. If teachers aren't paid to where they can feel comfortable to do all the parts of the job, then they're going to become frustrated. If you have a young child who's in daycare and you're making $35,000, $40,000 and trying to pay a mortgage, and you have $500,000 in student debt, of course you're going to become frustrated. So add in all the frustrations of the classroom combined with the financial pressure that you're facing in life. It's plain and simple, it's not fair. Even the Wall Street Journal ran an article saying that going into teaching, plain and simply, is not a good investment, because you're taking on so much debt, you're taking on so much money, and then you're not getting paid enough to put it back. And so I think it contributes to everything, contributes to the teacher shortage, everything that's frustrating teachers is because I can't do my job and be happy because I have more bills. At nighttime, I can't go home and relax because I have to drive Uber or work a second job. And so all those pressures, financial pressures of life, combined with the expected pressures of being a teacher, are just too much. And so until we fairly compensate teachers, because no one gets into it wanting to be rich. Like she said, the young lady said she's been thinking of this since she was 5 years old. Well, we have people like that, but no one should get into teaching to go into debt. And so until we basically increase teacher pay, you're going to see all these other frustrations boil to the top because people don't feel that they're fairly compensated for their work.
Our friends at Towson might be reconsidering their invitation because they're going to see a decline. So I mean, and we're going to go to questions first. I do want to just sort of weigh in on this piece too. So pay is the issue in so many ways, and we have a structural issue in not only how we compensate people coming in, but how we support them in schools, but also differentiate pay scales, make sure they have opportunities to learn and grow, take on more, if you're taking on more responsibility and you get better results, you should get more pay, right? We have to start having those conversations about how we incentivize people when they're in it as well. Rodney, you want to get in on that?
And we need to make sure the Department of Education follows through on their promises of helping teachers pay off loans rather than denying 99% of claims after they promised them on the front end.
Exactly right. Okay, so we have virtual and physical audience members that have questions. So let's start with physical audience. And if there are questions, there are a couple microphones. Please speak into them because you need to speak into the mic so it can be captured on the live stream. So are there any questions from folks here? And then we'll go to, if anybody in the live stream, we'll go back and forth. Yeah, and if you have a question specifically for someone on the panel, just say, I want to ask this person, or if it's just sort of general, then we can figure it out.
Hi, my name is Laura Harrison. I'm very lucky to be a dual certification major in elementary and special education here at Towson. My question is primarily for Mr. Robinson, but for everybody. I'm sure you may have heard in Florida, Orlando, Florida last week, a 6-year-old girl of color with a disability was arrested, put in handcuffs, fingerprinted, and given a mugshot for having a temper tantrum in school and kicking a teacher when it happened. We know that the school to prison pipeline is a real thing. How do we justify how we discipline students when we can't constructively help them develop age-appropriate responses, and instead we're suspending them, we're arresting 6-year-olds by school resource officers instead of helping our students? How do we solve that? How do we make strides towards changing that?
That officer was fired, by the way, yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. But the officer shouldn't have been in the school to start with.
That's right.
Especially in the elementary school. Why are police officers in elementary schools? No elementary school I know has a gang issue or those issues that we tend to associate with law enforcement. But more importantly, I think it goes back to a bit of the dissatisfaction piece we talked about with teachers. Teachers are overburdened and overworked and underpaid. And so they tend to welcome help when it comes to handling discipline and other issues. However, the help that's being offered by legislatures around the country is police officers. No, the help that should be offered is social workers, school counselors. And so it's really important that we understand how police officers don't make schools safer. They make them more dangerous, especially for students of color. And so we need to eliminate all police officers in school. For example, there's a police chief in Virginia who's required to have, by his county, to have school resource officers on school property. Well, he parks them outside the school. They literally sit outside the school every day. And they only come into school when called by the principal to handle issues. And so we need instances like that. We need to check our memorandums of understandings between schools and local police officers, and we should distinctly say in those memorandums, you cannot make arrests on campuses if we want to eliminate the school to prison pipeline.
Anybody else want to weigh in on
Yes.
this?
I just
Lynn
want to
and then
say
Robert.
very quickly, and we do not arm teachers.
just about every discussion in education worth having gets very quickly, if it's worth having, to it's complicated. So I don't disagree with you whatsoever about over-policing of the schools. However, I will just to offer a different perspective. The school safety officer in my school in the South Bronx was the mayor of that school, a beloved figure. Everybody knew her, she knew everybody. If you have the view that I tend to encourage of viewing schools as civic institutions, there was nothing oppressive about that. It was warm. She was lovely. But in the issue of the 6-year-old in Florida, which is, I mean, frankly, just stupid and inexcusable, that's a really good illustration of what I was discussing earlier about this tension that exists between policy and schools. Where do we trust local folks and professionals to make decisions? Where do we need a policy to say thou shalt or thou shalt not? So in this case, and I don't know as much as you do about this instance in Florida, it sounded like there was local discretion to act, somebody acted badly, and they had a consequence.
So I just to weigh in on this, two things. One, last year we have a lot of poll data on this question around school security and what people want, and we happened to poll right after the Parkland massacre. So it really captured people's attention, and people are all over the place in lots of ways. There's also the politics of it, and I can just speak as a former superintendent and what people want to see. So I agree with Rodney in many ways, but at the same time, it's so hard to say, no, we're not going to do it, because parents are going to be up in arms. There are structural, systemic things you can put in place and you can negotiate so that these kinds of incidents don't happen and so that the principal is always seen as the one in charge. But I digress. Do we have anybody, Terrence, on the virtual who's chiming in and wants a question? No? All right. So folks that are watching us on the web, please chime in if you want. If not, we'll go back to anybody in the audience who have a question for a panelist or just in general. Please. Yeah. Yeah, can we have the mic just so that folks know?
Hi, I'm faculty here at Towson University, and my role here, I have been an advisor, I've been a university supervisor teaching graduate, undergraduate students, and it has been a dream job for me. However, one of the things that I constantly hear from current students and students that I've had years ago, I'll get an email every once in a while, they really do understand that they are doing noble work. They're doing good work. They understand that. But their frustration is that society does not recognize the teaching profession at the same level as the medical field or the legal field. And I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, how do we address that?
I have no idea how to change society, beyond my pay grade.
Well, not that, but I mean, what do we do because we have to be in control of our own image.
Right. So it's a narrative question, right? How do we
Yes.
change the narrative around what it means to be an educator in this country? Yeah, Rodney, you want to talk about that? And then we can see Phyllis and Lynn if you want to.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with how we perceive ourselves. And sometimes I think we are our own worst advertisers. When we come home from work for the day, some people instantly hit social media and start talking about the things on their job. And therefore that spreads the word of negativity. And don't get it, I mean, understand that it's okay to be frustrated, but sometimes people gravitate toward negativity. And so when you put a negative vibe out there on your situation, people are gonna run with it. If it's someone makes a simple statement on social media, they're now getting a call from a news crew, because they want to interview about the situation. So I think it's really up to us to take control of the narrative, for us to write positive pieces, for us to write about the great things that our school's doing. The media will show up for the school fight, but they won't show up for the school play. And so we need to take control of the narrative and put out that positive attention. But in the end, you know, it boils down to, I think society doesn't view us because we're a capitalistic society. And so most people are measured by what is their numerical value to our country. And so therefore, we can't put a numeric value on the teacher. So therefore, society tends not to view us in this high esteem as we view the other people in society.
Phyllis, you want to weigh in on that narrative question, right? How do we change the narrative around what it means to be an educator?
So part of it goes back to making the pie bigger and really giving away that which you most crave yourself, and really making sure that as educators, we're praising each other and giving each other positive feedback, particularly if we're not feeling it from outside our field. And then using our strengths to really elevate the profession however we can. If you're a writer, write about what you're doing. If you're into policy, advocate for changes. So I think it also goes back to that sense of agency that we keep returning to. The less you're getting that external validation, or the less that you're able to rely on that external respect, the more you need to figure out ways to manufacture satisfaction for yourself, because we're not going to change society. I don't know how to do that either.
Lynn, you want to weigh in on this narrative question, then Robert? Sure.
Well, let's face it, teaching is a feminized profession. And typically in our society, those things which we value are not professions that are dominated by women. And I think that has a lot to do with the viewpoint, just to be very candid. I know that nurses have actually done a specific campaign and there was a collaboration between different nursing associations to actually elevate the image of nursing, and that seems to have started to work. I think that we need to do the same thing. I think in addition to teachers having that sense of advocacy for themselves and to do the things that our panelists have said, we also need to speak into the space that they are as valuable as doctors. In fact, I think teaching is the most important profession, period. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. It is the foundation of everything that we value in this country. And so to the extent that we actually address this on a number of issues, and a number of fronts is incredibly important. But I do think that because it's dominated by women, society does devalue it, and that's really a shame because it's the most important profession.
Robert, you want to weigh in on
Well,
there?
actually, the question, and thank you for the question, because I hadn't really thought about this until now. There's some cognitive dissonance here. And Josh, fact check me on the poll. Parents are valuing or rate their own schools highly. They tend to be supportive of teachers even striking for higher pay, but at the same time, teachers feel disrespected. Well, the poll says they are respected, at least local teachers. I mean, there's this goes back decades. My school is great. Those kids' schools are terrible. That's just like Congress. We think our own is good and everybody else's is terrible. But that suggests that there's a level of respect accorded to teachers, at least my teachers, my kids' school, that maybe that's not getting through to teachers. Why is that? That's odd.
Yeah, so there is some, in the data you'll see, and we've shown this in other years, that much like Robert is saying, folks do have confidence in teachers and they trust them, right? I don't know if you saw I think it was Pew that just did a poll, maybe it was Gallup, whoever it was, on the most trusted professions. Principals were like the most highly trusted people out there. I forget what the other one was. So there's this weird disconnect between the local and then the larger public narrative about it, what's in the newspaper, the way politicians talk about it, and those sorts of things, which is why it is so essential that teachers become actively involved in advocating for the profession, right? In advocating, because and I won't go into things like pension shifts and all the kind of stuff that happens at state levels that actually take money away from your ability to buy supplies, which is what politicians decide to do, but teachers need to become better advocates. And I guess my thing, because folks at the local level, they really do trust and have confidence broadly. Those are broad data, it's not individual. And you got to leverage that with relationship building, and in some ways maybe not even worry about the national conversation so much, because there are other people that spend all their time for their own interests who are trying to push certain narratives. Other questions in here? We got another one back there with the mic, and then Terrence, you'll give me a high sign if anybody on the web wants. Yeah.
Hi, Bob Blake. I'm on faculty here also. It turns out I'm from a long lineage of teachers. I never expected that to happen. But I've got a real simple solution to this, but it's going to be extremely, extremely complicated, and we can't solve society. I've learned over the years the value of language and the definitions of terms. Let's just simply stop referring to teachers as staff and call them faculty. And look up the definition. It's a profession. Staff is a connotation of lower level support people. We are not staff. You are not staff. You are faculty. We change that, could be like the guy who started a forest fire on a golf course by hitting his golf club against a rock. Maybe we could ignite something.
Language matters, right? I mean, the way we describe ourselves, the way we describe people around us, language matters. Anybody, yeah. Other thoughts, questions? Any of the students out there, you guys you all are preparing to become teachers, which we are thankful for and appreciate, and I know you're going to do awesome things. Any questions you all have for our panel? Yeah. And we'll just wait for the mic just so that people on the live stream can hear it.
One of the things, I'm an early childhood major, undergraduate major at Towson, and one of the things we talk a lot about in our classes is kind of like how you said nurses are campaigning. Where do we find time and like resources to fight for teacher pay and other things like that when we have so much going on our plate, like advice-wise?
Any of you want to take that? Lynn, let's start with you, right? What do you think? How should people, I think it's a great question, right? You got all the stuff to do, and now you're asking me to be an activist also. So what's the most efficient and effective way to do it? What do you all think?
Well, yes, first. I mean, I think that, teachers, in my mind, teachers are agents of change. I mean, education is it literally is about opening minds, right? And so to the extent that you are your own advocate and you partner with colleagues around that is incredibly important. I think you need our support in doing that. Certainly, you're going to get that from an association like mine. There are other associations that represent the faculty, to use our Towson faculty members' term, the faculty, teachers in our communities. But it has to be both. It's not either or, it really is both and. That sense of being a change agent among all of you is incredibly important, and for us to support that is incredibly important. And someone might have more concrete ideas, but I just wanted to instill the fact that it really is about you too.
Phyllis, then Robert, then Rodney.
I'll echo the power in numbers, but I would also add to that you should leverage the parents in your community. As we saw from the poll, the parents are really on board and are on the same page and are ready and willing to advocate with you. And often they are the squeaky, they are the ones who are able to make the change happen faster than the teachers on the ground. So I think giving them the chance to help you and partner with you would help.
Robert?
If I haven't given enough unpopular answers today, here's a really unpopular one. Don't. And what I mean by that is you have no end of difficulty ahead of you as a new teacher. About the last thing I would advise you to be concerning yourself with as a new teacher is advocacy work. Take the time to get good at your craft. Take the time to learn your subject. Take the time to just be good at your job. Hopefully you'll be in a setting where there are experienced teachers who can pick up whatever battle flag it is you feel compelled to support and have them march for you. But as new teachers, honest to God, it's about the last thing I'd be concerned with.
Rodney?
I would say work through your students. And what I mean by that is teach your students how to advocate for themselves. When students learn how to advocate for themselves, they get in rooms. And by you being the teacher, you get into rooms. And so when you get into rooms with these people, you can start talking about some of your needs, but you're still teaching your students and working. It's sort of like combining multiple jobs into one thing. If I teach my students how to advocate and they get into rooms that can advocate for themselves, well, I'm in that room as well. And so now I can advocate for myself with whether it be your local school board, your mayor, city council, whatever room you can get into.
You want to follow up on it?
I just wanted to add one more thing, that as a new teacher, my focus is my students, and that's what I care about. But the little part of me that still wants to try to fight for us to be more respected and valued in the community. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, so this is going to sound like shameless plug, but it's true. Join PDK and Educators Rising. And the reason I say that, I mean, just give me a second. In 1906, right, educators in the country were saying, you know what, we actually have to organize ourselves. We have to become active. We have to activate. I'm looking at Randy Schmaltz sitting right here. When he was a young teacher, Randy, just raise your hand. When he was a young teacher starting, I said, where do I go where I can get with other teachers who are thinking about how I can be active and influence and learn, and PDK was born out of that in many ways. We're trying to recapture that, some of that, with Educators Rising and Ed Rising Collegiate. And I know it's a shameless plug, but it's like a true shameless plug. That's why we exist. We're created and what we're trying to do, because there are other people who want to do it. And I mean, just Dwayne, like, so you're right. You got to focus on your kids, and all that activism can be seen through your kids. But creating community is so incredibly important. It can come through your local university and alumni or chapters, or whether conferences, blogging, whatever it may be. But it's important to exercise those muscles too, because a lot of people who are attracted to teaching want that. I got on my soapbox again. I apologize. Other questions that anybody may have? Yeah, right there.
Hi, this isn't a question, really more of a follow-up comment. I work for the National Education Association, so I just don't want to overlook the role of unions and professional associations in your question. I think there's a perception that NEA and EFT are really focused on contract bargaining, but we do so much more than that in terms of educator voice and advocating, and we are a member-driven, member-run organization, and we have student chapters, so I just wanted to make sure that didn't get overlooked.
Talk about unions. Right? Anybody want to touch that one? I mean, what's the role of unions in all of this? Bad or good? And we have great relations with NEA. They've been incredibly supportive of Educators Rising. As I always say, the national conversation, local conversations sometimes don't always jive. But I don't know. Rodney, you wanna take that one on, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, I've been a member of the NEA since I started teaching, and that doesn't mean I haven't had my disagreements with some NEA policy. But you have to have a group there speaking and giving teachers voice. Because if you don't, then you have politicians making all the decisions without a check. And so getting back into civics education, we need checks and balances. And so unions are a check on political ideas, political ideologies, or political agendas that don't favor our students. And now sometimes unions may have political agendas as well, but as long as we have those voices in the room, we can all cooperate and do what's best for our kids.
One would hope. Anybody else want to touch the union question?
This is more nitty-gritty, but I would say that as a new teacher, you want to make sure you know all of your avenues of support, not union, HR, your rights if you're in a situation where you need support from somebody. So I think they're important, but I think it's very often, and this is what I hear from colleagues and what I'm hearing for the Career Confidential column, very often people have no idea how they can agitate or get support for themselves when it's a more individual problem as opposed to a more systemic issue.
Lynn and then Robert.
I was going to wimp out and not take this question.
Do you want me to just go
Please. I have, bail me out.
Well, I don't know that I'm going to bail you out, but I'll simply say that, AACTE was founded nearly 75 years ago to support the public schools and public school teachers. And, in that relationship we've had over the years, we have, had a strong relationship with NEA and AFT. We certainly talk with them and partner on, I think, some ways in which we can create capacity, greater capacity for our teacher candidates to look at how we can affect change. So yeah, I mean, I think that as Phyllis said, there are a whole host of folks that we all associate with and partner with to do the work.
In the halls in which I roam, the ed reform world, teacher unions are generally considered to be a bad guy. That said, I've never been a union basher. I'm not if you give me a magic wand, to change things in education, unions are not going to be the first thing I aim it at. I have a wish for unions, however, and that is, I don't want to overstate the case, but I think we have a bit of a crisis in professional practice in classrooms. And I'll use the AFT, I know you're NEA. but AFT, I know a little bit better. For years, they've had this wonderful quarterly called The American Educator. I'm an unrepentant disciple of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr., core knowledge. Maybe you've heard of him in some of your classes. The AFT has been stalwart, unlike my ed reform colleagues, in supporting his work and drawing attention to it. That said, it hasn't translated. For whatever reason, the advocacy work that is being done, or maybe it's not being done on behalf of unions to improve professional practice, I just don't see why it's not making the leap. So I would love to challenge unions to say, hey, you don't like what testing and accountability and what politicians are doing to schools. I don't disagree with that. What can the unions do to improve professional practice? Because right now I feel like it's not happening.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions? There's someone back there, and just please wait for the microphone.
So I'm a faculty member here in the College of Ed. I know you guys alluded to the study about religious study in schools, and it seemed like some on the panel wanted to talk about that, so I wanted to encourage them to do so.
Yeah, so this whole question around religion, thank you for bringing that one back up and go back to the data. What do y'all think about this desire to see religion taught in the schools, the desire for comparative religion? There's some other interesting data in there that speaks to whether or not people think that their own religion will be compromised by teaching religion, and people, for the most part, don't feel that way, although evangelicals, self-identified, tend to be more concerned about that. Rodney, we want to start with the religion question? What's your take on it?
I just wonder, it's not criticizing the poll, but
you can criticize.
If you had asked people, do you prefer Quran classes, would you have gotten that 61%, support? And so I think a lot of times when we look at religion, it's all in how we frame that question.
Yep.
Because if we see a question with something that we identify with, of course we're going to support it. But if it's something that the majority of people in this country don't agree with, then you're going to get a much more negative thing. But I think just Bible classes itself are a non-starter, because that ultimately goes back to the First Amendment. And so I don't think we should have Bible classes, but I do think we should have classes on comparative religion. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if we really want, religion taught, it should be taught strictly from an academic point of view. But when you choose one book over the other and you give kids that choice and parents that choice, then we get into some really, really tricky First Amendment issues.
Yep. Just one quick point. So I always say, at best, the data help you ask better questions. We ask high-level questions, and this is why we have toolkits on the website, so that people in local communities can dig into it a little more. Let's just go down the line with the religion question.
Civics teacher hat. The Establishment Clause of the Constitution says that you cannot establish a religion. That is freedom. That is not freedom from religion. So I respectfully disagree.
Right.
That said, I'm not eager to see Bible study as religious indoctrination. I invoked E.D. Hirsch Jr.'s name a few moments ago. The core knowledge guy wrote Cultural Literacy 30 years ago. So I do think that the poll probably is surfacing a hunger for values. That said, my reason for wanting to see children learn religion and study religion comparatively is because I'm an unrepentant E.D. Hirschian. There is so much language, and I can geek out on this forever, that is redolent with biblical references and allusions. The mark of Cain, David and Goliath, turn the other cheek, Judas, cast the first stone, on and on and on. This is what language is. The Hirsch's big insight is that writers and speakers make assumptions about what their listeners and readers know. And when those assumptions are correct, language proficiency happens almost organically. When it doesn't, all you hear is womp, 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 womp. So I would argue, from a Hirschian perspective, if we are not teaching the cultural allusions and idioms that educated people know, we are quite literally imposing a form of illiteracy on children.
Lynn, religion.
I have to admit, when you went wah, 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 it made me think of Charlie Brown's teacher.
That's a cultural literacy reference. She gets the
you go.
reference.
For a certain generation.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Josh, for
Well,
that
it's mine
addition.
too, Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I would not support Bible study. And as I look at the complexity of the world as it is today, you know, this way in which I think comparative religion can actually speak to that. I think we have globally much more emphasis on religious belief and the difference that it purportedly has in shaping culture and in shaping how people relate to one another, in a way that I don't think we've seen until the recent past. And I would gather that, you know, I would probably say since 9/11. I mean, I think we really have, there's a way in which we've seen the globe really shape itself around religious identity, as well as, you know, what we see happening with nativism. So the notion of a comparative religion course from that perspective is really intriguing to me as a way of understanding the world right now.
Phyllis.
You know, I can't drill down and know exactly how people were interpreting the question, but I wonder if really it speaks to people's desire to see more character education, to have people embrace differences more readily, and to understand other perspectives better, and to foster more kindness and more empathy, because I think it's so lacking right now in our culture. So I don't have any problem at all with character education. I also would not love to see Bible studies in the schools. Comparative literature, I'm thinking now about your statistic about arts and music, you know, maybe as an elective in addition to art, music, and other things, but not necessarily above and more important than those arts. So, but to me, if I were asked that question, I might personally interpret it as, do you want to see more character education in the schools? And I wonder how many people were seeing it that way as well.
Yep. It's always a question.
Just very quickly, one of the things that I also, when you just mentioned art and music, Phyllis, you know, there's a correlation between musical aptitude and mathematical aptitude, and I think that gets lost somewhere, as though an understanding of music is in and of itself this singular thing. And so it's actually really sad if parents want their kids to go into computer programming and the like, they might want them to be musicians too.
Yeah, we haven't even started talking about the STEM obsession.
Right.
There was a young lady with a question back there. I think
So
that'll
I
probably be the last one.
am also an undergrad major here, and I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me in the polling that you did was the 60% of black parents distrust the school in their disciplining. And I think my question is, most counties I feel like have their own classroom management programs that they use, but what I'm beginning to see is that that doesn't work for every child. And obviously as a teacher, my main objective is to cater to each child as much as I can. So what would you recommend in how to, you know, work that into your disciplining rather than just catering to the classroom management program, if that makes sense?
So is there one person in particular you want to address this, or have everybody?
Probably Mr. Robinson.
We'll go with Robinson, then we'll go Phyllis.
Really it goes back to acknowledging your own implicit bias. I think a lot of times when we have racial conversations, people, you know, especially non-people of color, put up walls. And they don't want to have these tough, hard conversations. And so it's really important that we start having these conversations, because all the numbers say that schools are failing our students of color. And so it's important that we acknowledge our implicit bias, that we read, that we have conversations, and we invite the parents in, and we invite the students into these conversations. Because if we know a system is not working, why are we continuing to do the same thing? And so I just recently read How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is one of the best books I've ever read on the topic of acknowledging your implicit bias and the different things that go into all the measures that we see when it comes to student achievement, student gap. It even goes into sexuality, gender, race. And so just starting those conversations. If it's no more than just you and a teacher that you know reading the book and having the conversation. Inviting people of color, people that are LGBTQ, inviting everyone into that safe space and having those conversations of how are we and our policies affecting students of color, and what can we do better to serve all students' needs.
So I think that is actually a great way to end this portion of our morning by saying starting the conversation, right? You got to be willing to have the conversations with all different kinds of folks. So let me First, thank our wonderful panel. You guys are, as always, great. Buy their books, follow them on Twitter, all that kind of stuff. Let me thank the Towson University, President Schatzel, the School of Ed, Dean Mullen, also the Educators Rising Collegiate Volunteers, Layla Richmond, Kelly McNeil, Robin Smith, and Libby Wincoop, and Towson just been great for this. We are going to continue this conversation at the PDK Town Hall on October 22nd at 5 p.m. October 22nd at 5 p.m. We're going to do a national town hall on this. Go to pdkintl.org for more information. And I just want to make sure I once again thank Joan Richardson, who's the director of our poll, and the PDK team, particularly Nicole David, just to organize and all that. So thank you all for coming. Very much appreciate it. Goodbye to those of you who are out there in the ether. I hope you enjoyed the live stream, which will be public after. And thanks for coming. Appreciate it.